Um, so we're going to get started here. Let me throw out what percentage of modernizations fail. Is it 20%, 50%, or 80%? Don't be shy. It's just the two of you guys.
80%.
80%. All right. Any other?
Yeah, I've got to go 80.
You're right. It's 80%. And so, the question is why? And what you see is typically the scenario shows up, right? The boss comes in, you'll be done in 9 months, right? The poor employee's like, yeah, sure. But, right, you're saying sure, but it's gray. You really have no idea what you're doing, but you're going to report it all green. And then as you dive in, you realize, like, oh my, it's much bigger than I thought. You're still reporting it all green because delivering bad news is hard in most companies until you get to the very end when suddenly it goes from yellow to red and it becomes an exploding watermelon, right? And I don't know about y'all and Dan and John, I think you've been mostly working for yourself, so this is maybe foreign to you, but if you've worked in a large organization, this is pretty commonplace. Uh, Dan, tell me whether you've seen this play out or not.
Oh yeah, I've been a part of projects that have played out this way, and it's not enjoyable.
Yes. So, and at the end of it, right, the most important part of any project, it's not the brainstorming, it's the blame storming. So, right, and so it's important. One of the key takeaways here is to identify your scapegoat early on for when the project goes sideways. So that's a real lesson here. And so the question is why? And fundamentally, from my perspective, it's expectations not aligning with reality, right? The thought is, oh, this is going to be easy. It's 2 to 3 to 5x as hard as expected. Plans equal reality, when the reality is plans are illusions. You can ignore the laggards and edge cases, focus on the averages, the 80%, but really your laggards are your largest customer and your edge cases are critical. They drive all of your complexity and risk. The MVP model works. Really, it guarantees disaster. You can measure progress based on quantity of code, tasks, and features completed. And really, quantity is the wrong metric for measuring progress. It's all about how do you mitigate risk. So what should you do? First, embrace uncertainty, right? You don't, that's one of the biggest things. It's one of the biggest challenges for organizations. Focus on risk reduction. Understand augmentation versus replacement. I haven't seen a lot of literature about this, but this is, I think, a key thing that people overlook. I'll dive into. Adopt the minimum viable replacement. And finally, use the watermelon detector. So we're going to get started talking about embracing uncertainty and focusing on risk reduction. So the way I think about it, risk is driven by three things: uncertainty, complexity, and impact. And I'm going to dive into this. So we're going to start off with uncertainty. So there's what you know, right? At the top of the glacier, of the iceberg, and there's what you don't know. Typically, when you go into these things, you know the 20%, not the 80%. So what happens when you create a plan based on the 20%, right? It's going to be wildly wrong. The other piece is, it's not just, why don't you know it, right? You people left their job, they've retired, they ate too much bacon, right? They just, and then you have things, what I call the paperclip problem, right? Paper clips, they're for clipping paper together, but we use them in all sorts of different ways, right? To pop open CD-ROMs, to hang things. And what I find is people figure out how to use your technology in all sorts of creative ways that you never thought of. So you'll be surprised as you try to modernize, like you run into things, use case that you never would have suspected. And then, different people have different expectations. Different customers will have different, some people love certain things, some people won't. What works for a really large company doesn't work for a small company and vice versa. And then, just to put things in context, right? I've been married 26 years and I'm probably, if I'm lucky, I have a 50% batting average on delivering gifts that actually improve the relationship as opposed to degrade it. And if you think about products and features enhancements, the goal is to really improve that relationship, to to, but these are people that we don't live with. There may be hundreds, thousands of them. So the probability of us actually getting exactly what they want, right, is pretty low. And so if we can't do this for our spouses, why should we expect better results with our customers? Now, we can combine that uncertainty with complexity, and we'll show how that plays out. So probability pop quiz. All right, you've got this handy dandy fancy Gantt chart. You've got 20 tasks and you're 90% confident that you get each one done on time and with quality, right? What's the overall probability when you get to the 20th task that you'll be on time, delivering everything as planned? Anybody want to take a guess here? What is that number? Is it going to be 90%, 80%, 70%?
12.
12. You nailed it. Either A, you've seen me present this before, or you're good. You actually understood how to do the calculation, whipped it out pretty quickly. But
yeah, I had to reference the calculator on that one.
Yeah, this is something that I think, like, I didn't understand this until I kept getting beaten up. Why was my team, and at the time I was managing 4 teams, and like we were saying we're 80% confident. Why are we missing everything all the time? Well, the fundamentals is once you get that complexity, your ability to forecast the future just falls through the floor. So, like, I tell people, they remember nothing else besides the blame storming. Is that the ability to forecast the future decays exponentially, making it impossible to accurately predict outcomes for projects that combine both uncertainty and complexity, right? You see how quickly, your ability to forecast goes to zero. And, this is one of the hardest things for people to accept, because we've been raised to believe you just work hard enough, you just plan enough, that you can achieve the outcomes you set out to, that you can predict the future. And it just doesn't work that way. I mean, after all, like, this is the projections for a hurricane. These are models run through the largest, fastest supercomputers on Earth, and their projections are everywhere from the south of Florida to Canada. So, in just a few days out. So why should we expect any different from, lowly mortals who are, operating with 20% of the knowledge required? And this is, again, from a cultural perspective, these Gantt charts look pretty and they make us feel and look smart, but they're just lies. And, we need to embrace the fact that we're moving to hypothesis. We're kind of going to be discovery. It's going to be messy. And again, that's just a huge cultural shift for organizations that think, the future can be predicted, which is why, I argue that instead of having your project start out green, have them start out red and then move to yellow or green as you mitigate your risk, key milestones are hit, right? Particularly if you have fixed scope and dates, or gray if your time and resources aren't fixed, right? Because at the end of the day, you're until you reduce your risk and complexity, you really have no idea how long it's going to take. And at FedEx, we saw that, somebody did an analysis that on average we were 3 to 5x that the predicted time, cost, etc., was about 3 to 5x the original. So, and that's a pretty sophisticated organization. I haven't seen any different with other organizations. Does this make any sense? All right. I'll assume quiet means either put you to sleep or yes.
Yeah, you're good.
All right. Now let's talk about impact. And so, can anybody guess what this is a chart of? This is basically $2 billion here on the right and $523 billion here on the left. All right, I'll tell you. It's the Fortune 1000, and Walmart's over here on the far left. I think this is actually 2020, so it's the number's even bigger. But you see how, like, Walmart is literally 2 times bigger than the 5th largest company, 263 times bigger than the smallest Fortune 1000, 13,000 times bigger than the largest small business, one that has 500 employees, and 11 million times bigger than the average small business, right? It's massive. It's what I call hyper-Paretoism. And so, like, while I made up this term, it's a real concept. And what you see this play out more and more, the larger your population set, the bigger the impact a very small percentage has. And so you see this play out with your customer base, with your use cases, et cetera, where just these very, you know, small percentages have huge impacts. And what's fascinating is you can run a model and you see this actually plays out just in real life. Just kind of it's so if you give 5,000 people $1,000 each in this model and you just run it where people are either losing or getting money, look at what happens. Look how that skew just plays out, right? You see a huge chunk of folks basically winding up with nothing, and a small minority winding up with a ton. So at the end, you have 50% have less than $500, and you have 1% that have as much as the bottom 30 to 50%. So, right, you see that impact in your customer base. And that's why, when you look at averages, you ignore the fact that the 1% really drive like the overwhelming percentage of your risk, your complexity, etc. And to the point is, right, impact ties to complexity. So like Walmart, right? They're in 24 countries, they got 48 brands, they got 10,500 locations, right? The number of permutations goes to the roof. You start putting employees. So that complexity and impact goes together, which is why typically what you see is people do their planning based on, the 80, 90, 95, 99%. What happens is they ignore the 1%, which is really, or the 0.1%, which is really where all your biggest risk, highest complexity, uncertainty impact is, which is why projects tend to blow up just when people think they're done. They get to the last little bit and they're like, oh, we only have a few more customers left to migrate. We only have this, one territory, whatever. But they typically leave the hardest, most complex to the end. And they discover that, oops, it doesn't work that way. And so I saw this firsthand at FedEx. The team was celebrating that they only had 330 customers left. They'd migrated, I think, like 7 million over to the new system. And they're like, we're going to be done in 2 months. We're going to be done in November. And I was just like, yeah, I think add 3 years to that. And sure enough, it took another 3 years because that's where all the complexity was. That make any sense? Have you guys seen that play out at all?
Maybe not to that extent, but yeah, I've certainly been a part of a number of projects that have run over.
Yeah.
3 years, yeah, that's rough.
Yeah. And then so now let's talk in augmentation versus replacement. So right, you've got a laptop, you're given a smartphone, you're augmenting it, right? You can do most of the tasks that you used to do on your laptop, you now do it on your smartphone, plus some that you couldn't do, which is great. You're not losing anything because you're able to just, it's an add-on. But now if I take away the laptop, now the phone, you're replacing it, and your expectations are it should do everything that your laptop did, but in reality, it won't. So, right, now you're dealing with the whole issue of loss aversion. And so that's a fundamental difference. And people tend to forget that, they're like, oh, well, we can have the new system do, 80, 90% of the old system, that'll be good enough. But it doesn't work that way. When you're replacing, the expectation is, it should match everything the old system did. And why is that? It's this concept called loss aversion, which says a bird in the hand is equal to 2 in the bush, right? We whatever we have, we value much more than what we might get in the future. And so even if we rarely use stuff, right? We have this cherry pitter that hasn't been used, right? And we all have these in our house. We can't get rid of it because, well, I might use it, right? So it doesn't even matter whether we're actually using it. We might, once we have it, we're like, well, I can't get rid of that. And so that's why you wind up with so many features that are rarely used. And, people go like, well, but it hardly gets used. We don't need that. But the customers are usually like, what? But I might use it. Or they do use it, but they only use it once a year to close, to deal with taxes or to deal with compliance or something. So, um, again, another reason why those extremes really drive so much of the risk and complexity. Now, side with the minimum viable replacement, right? MVPs are great when you have something like this, right? This kid has no shoes, you give him shoes, you give him a skateboard, give him a bike, give him a Cybertruck, right? These are all upgrades. Now, what if he's already driving a pickup truck? Is he going to trade down for a shoe, a skateboard, a bike, or even a Cybertruck? Oh, but that truck is customized just for him, just the way he or she wants it, and it's driven by your largest customer. Are they going to trade down, or even trade it for the Cybertruck when they've got this thing that's customized just for them? And by the way, if you can't get them to migrate, you wind up having to support the old system and the new system. And this is what we ran into at FedEx is like, hey, we can migrate everybody over, but Walmart and Amazon. It's like, okay, great. So do I fire them? I still got to, I can't shut down the old system, even though only 2 customers using it because they have, such a huge impact. In that case, really the MVP model worked? No, because MVP is typically about like, what's that smallest thing you can bring to the market that a slice of the market might want, right? In that case, embrace the minimum viable replacement. And so the MVR or minimum viable replacement really is all the capabilities, work, and experiences required to migrate users from one technology, system, or process to another. So you think about it, an MVP is like, what's the bare minimum I need to get an initial slice of customers? An MVR is what I need to do to migrate all of my existing customers to the new version, retire the old system, right? So not only does, the 80%, but you also need to migrate the rhinos, hippos, giraffes, and elephants, right? Those largest customers that don't look like anybody else. And you know, I'm talking about this in the case of you're replacing legacy computer systems, or really an MVR. Anytime you're replacing one system with another, is you're really dealing with, what's that minimum viable replacement required to get somebody to migrate from the way they used to do things to the way that they do things that you want them to do in the future, right? So it's a good concept to have, and it's really from the customer or market or system perspective. It's fundamentally like, how do you swap out, one technology for another, and think about it realistically. So like, again, with an MVP is, oftentimes you're trying to figure, is there a market for my product? With an MVR, it's like, will my existing customers switch from their old version to the new version? So like, oftentimes, you don't need the research. You've already proven that there's an, demand for computers. So you don't need to do that research for an MVR. You need to figure out is, well, what's it going to take to get people to migrate from the old system to the new, right? It's a different type of research. And again, an MVP, typically you're focused on their innovators, early adopters. MVR is everyone from innovators to laggards. And by the way, your laggards are typically your largest customers, right? That's what people overlook. And not only they're your largest customers, but they don't look like anybody else, right? They've got their they're 40-foot ceilings, they've got a helipad, they're just wildly different. Which is why I say is design an architect for the 1% while delivering for the 80% first, right? Because if you don't design for those edge cases, when you get to them, the chances that your system's going to be have the flexibility, scalability, etc., are very low, and you're going to wind up with a bunch of rework. Does that making any sense so far? Learning anything new?
Yeah, can you just clarify your point? I hear what you're saying, design for the 1%, but you're saying deliver for the 80% first. But wouldn't the 80% have less in terms of needs and functionality than the actual 1%?
Yes. So that's why I say is you may not be able to build out all of the capabilities required to meet the 1% right out of the box, but you may be able to deliver, and I'll dive deeper into this in a moment, but you may be able to deliver, stuff that's good enough for everybody else. What you don't want to do is design and build for the 80% and then be like, oh, whoops, now we're at the 1%. We didn't design to support, the 40-foot ceilings and the helipad, right? Does that make any sense?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, some people just go with like, hey, like, let's just design and build let's start with the hardest problem first. And once we solve that, then everything else is easy. So that, there's not one, none of the stuff is paint by numbers. But the bottom line is you need to design with the most complex use cases in mind. And then maybe develop standard designs and features for the 90%, custom solutions for the 1%, and then shared infrastructure whenever possible. So, one of those things that can be leveraged across, all, all facets. But, that's why you may have a portfolio as opposed to just trying to force fit everybody into one single, application or solution. And then, oftentimes, for success, you need to slice the initiative into smaller MVPs, MVRs, right? You have different customer segments. So you have this initial customer segment. You'll take it this, maybe call it MVP, MVR. I don't know what I haven't set on the right terminology yet, but right for this customer segment, right? Their needs, they're pretty small. They have a single location. They, boom, you can deliver something for them. The next segment up, so on and so forth, until you get to the largest, and each one of those really needs to be almost treated as their own segment because they're so big and they have their own requirements. And not only that, but what people oftentimes overlook is that it's not just about the capabilities, but it's also about how do you migrate over, what are all the capabilities required to migrate customers from the old way to the new way. So like with electric vehicles, right, it's not enough to just have an electric vehicle. You also need to have the charging infrastructure, right? Or if you're doing software, maybe you need to migrate over their data. You need to migrate over, you need to do training. They need to integrate in their systems. And the migration oftentimes can take, 2 to 20x longer than the actual development of the product, depending on what it is, right? And at the end of the day, right, you're dealing with enterprise icebergs where 80% of the work required is invisible. So it's impossible to know the exact requirement. So you may have, some of it, but you won't know all of it, right? Because Lenny, who did that customization, ate too much bacon, and went out to pasture, and it's totally undocumented. So, how do you tackle this from, a kind of a process perspective? So the first thing is you want to map your customer base to identify where the biggest impacts lie. So like looking at your revenue per customer, like, oh, look, geez, this small slice here, they're, They're literally 100,000 times bigger than your smallest, your percent of revenue by customer segment, so you can see where things are skewed, right? And the more skewed, the more your risk is concentrated. And again, people tend to look at the number of customers and averages, but that really masks where your complexity and risk is. Then you want to analyze your application usage by feature capability. So see what's that look like. And oftentimes you won't have this. You may need an instrument to capture this. And again, this could also apply to a wide variety of scenarios. Um, then looking at your features, capabilities, existing customer segment. So what you might have said is, well, geez, only a small, these features F through T really only get used a small percentage of the time. So we just do A through E. We've got literally like 99, 99% of the capabilities covered. But then you look and you go, oh, wait, the King Kongs are the ones that are using all these one-offs. And, you can't afford to lose the King Kongs. And typically they're not willing to move unless it meets all of their requirements, right? What you oftentimes see also is that, there is a certain set of capabilities that the majority of customers use all the time. And so, these are things that you might be able to, A, take as a new form factor or capability to market and meet, a significant percentage of your customers' needs going into new markets. So the goal here is to develop stuff that doesn't take you away from your core roadmap, but kind of extends what you're building. So maybe you can build a mobile app that just has that one feature that you can then upsell. But right, you're going to have to build it, the core infrastructure anyways, and putting a mobile app on top of that might not be that difficult. Or, as a new API or a new geography, right? Going after new customers or giving new capabilities to your existing customers, but that aren't pure replacements. And then you want to look at what's that difficulty and dependencies. And again, what you often see is you started out with one core set of capabilities and then everything got added on top of those. But still, 90% of your customers use that core set of capabilities and that has the least dependencies. So, maybe you might be able to deliver this initial set of capabilities first while you're planning and architecting for these more complex use cases first. Again, there's no one like certain way to do everything. This is kind of just heuristic, some guidelines based on what I've seen. Does that make any sense? Was that helpful at all? And again, John, you're more in the, you know, construction development, so I don't know necessarily if this is relevant for you, but
Yeah, I
any
think it's helpful to listen to and hear. So yeah, thank you so far.
all right. Dan, learn anything that jumped out at you?
Yeah, I like the aspect of rolling out the features to your many smaller customers first as a way to greatly reduce the risk as well. Unfortunately for them, if something does go wrong early on, that's not as impactful to your business as the Walmart, for example. But in order to protect your own business, I think that's the prudent approach. So yeah, I like that framework.
Yeah, I think, people, I mean, there's how many stories of people blowing up. I think Levi's blew up Walmart and, 20% of their business was, they lost 20% of their business for like 6 weeks while they tried to fix stuff. But yeah, that's so your risks are much lower. You can test things out, etc. At least. Now let's go on to the watermelon detector, right? So your pointy haired boss comes to you, you'll be done in 9 months, right? You're like, sure. no way in hell, you're thinking. And so a watermelon detector is just basically this tool I developed to help you de-risk delivering bad news, right? And this is one of the things that, you're you are the boss, John, but for a lot of employees, it's tough to deliver bad news. So the goal is to help de-risk it by being able to point to a tool as opposed to just you being the guys being the negative Nelly. Identify and mitigate common risks, and then help assess confidence regarding estimated scope, size, timelines, values. It's not necessarily going to tell you like how big it is, but what's the probability that you've actually thought through all of the things required to really have an accurate assessment. And what it is basically right now it's just a worksheet and with a series of about 50 questions that you can go through and quickly answer to help you go is, well, what's the probability that we really know what we need to do, that we really understand how long it's going to take, what resources are required, that we've solved the hardest problems, etc. So you can quickly go through and just you know identify what those are, begin to mitigate them and communicate them in a way that's takes a lot of the stress away from you being the guy who's raising the bad, is raising red flags. And so the idea is like typically like you're starting a new project and you're oftentimes, bringing in outside contractors, you're bringing a new team, staying a new team. It's like, well, yeah, I got an estimate, but they're a new team. What's the probability that you're going to have, be able to give an accurate estimate? They've never worked together in it. So, right, that's going to wind up being red. How much experience they have with the technology, right? You typically, again, just standing at new technology that the existing teams never worked with it. So, what's that look like? What do they have from the subject matter expertise? Things like separate IT ecosystems being merged. Right now, you're just adding complexity. What are those customizations? And depending on how you select, it turns things either green, yellow, or red. And things that are red and yellow are things that you need to focus on and also highlight like yeah, you may call this green, but is it really? And so that's really around the execution of things is defined, but then does it will it deliver the value and will it get the adoption expected? So again, is it match and exceed current capabilities of the existing system? Like, no, right? And that was one of the things that FedEx was like, oh, it's an MVP. And it's like, well, no, people don't want 80%. They want 100% of what they used to have. And then things like, usability and value testing, right? It doesn't matter how much work you've done, you still haven't done usability value testing or destructive testing. If at the end, you haven't done that, what's the probability that you're actually going to deliver something that works for your customer, that scales, etc. So it's just, again, a way to quickly identify what risks are, regardless of, where supposedly you are from the project plan perspective. Does that make any sense?
Yes, yeah, I think so.
The you know, Dan, have you worked on projects where like people are just following, like, yeah, we did all the tasks and then like discover that even though it looked like the project was on track, it really wasn't because they overlooked key issues?
I'm not sure I've ever been a part of a project planning phase where we accounted for everything up front. If this is what you're getting at, I mean, I think every project I've ever been a part of, there's always been work that's been uncovered after the fact. And we may have checked all the original boxes and we still don't have a complete product that works the way we intended it to. So I think that's a very common occurrence.
but yet the project is marked green all the way through, and then people are surprised. It's to me, this is what's crazy. It's like Lucy and Lucy and Charlie Brown. No, wait, is it Lucy? Wait, yeah, who's the girl in Peanuts that Charlie Brown's always trying to kick the football from?
Yeah, I think you got it right. I think that's Lucy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, it's like every time, right? Charlie Brown goes to kick the football and she pulls it away, and it's like yet every time he does the same thing, and it's like projects are no different. Yet we're always shocked. You know, we have our fancy project plans, right? Yes, and then we're surprised that nothing works according to plan, right? And that's to me is one of the biggest barriers to success is just embracing that uncertainty. And this is a quick way of identifying what some of that uncertainty is, even if you've got like this, you know, fancy pantsy project plan. And then the idea is, you know, you can identify and track the issues, prioritize them, assign ownership, create mitigation plans, and communicate, and just iterate over time. And ideally, what should happen is, as you move further along your project, you know, you're seeing the risks be reduced, right? Um, so that you know you're still going to wind up with surprises, but fewer of them. And so next time, you know, you get the pointy-haired boss, is you'll be done in 9 months, right? You'll say, I'd love to agree, but the watermelon detector shows differently, right? And instead of you being the one who's got to deliver the bad news or not, you know, uh, not agreeing with the powers that be, you're able to point to something else as well. You know, realistically, we don't know. We can't know. And so that really ends things. And so in summary is embrace uncertainty, focus on risk reduction, understand augmentation versus replacement, adopt the minimum viable replacement, and use a watermelon detector to improve your chance of product success, right? It's that, but